In November 1952, a military aircraft entered the Alaska mountains and never emerged. Among the names on board was Colonel Eugene Smith, 39, an investigator whose life was spent chasing truth through broken evidence. Then he became the missing fact. No wreckage, no body, only waiting. He'll be heard from his brother, Michael said again and again. I can't know what Smith understood in those final minutes. I only know this question remains beneath the ice when a man who solved mysteries becomes one himself. What survives long enough to return Eugene Smith? Woke before dawn in Wilmington, Delaware, the way he always did when travel waited for him. The house was quiet enough that the ticking clock on the mantel sounded louder than it should have. He lay still for a moment, counting the seconds between each tick, then swung his feet to the floor. Cold wood pressed into his soles. He welcomed it. It meant the day had begun. He shaved carefully, slow strokes rinsing the blade after each pass. He disliked rushing this part. The mirror showed a man of 39 who looked older when he frowned, younger when he smiled, though he did neither this morning. He dried his face, folded the towel with deliberate creases, and set it exactly where it belonged. Order first. Movement later. That had become his rule. In the kitchen, he poured coffee into a chipped mug he'd owned since the war. The smell filled the room, sharp and grounding. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on damp pavement. Eugene stood at the counter, reading through a small stack of papers he had already read twice the night before. Transfer orders. Travel itinerary. Contact names in Anchorage. He tapped each page with his finger once, then again, as if counting would keep them from slipping away. He checked them a third time anyway. That habit had started years earlier when one missing signature had nearly cost him a case and a career. Since then, nothing left his hands without inspection. He folded the papers, slid them into a manila envelope, and wrote Alaska across the front in neat block letters. He paused, then underlined it. In the living room, his suitcase lay open on the sofa. He packed the same way every time, shirts rolled, socks tucked inside, shoes heavier items at the bottom. He placed his leather wallet on the armrest, then stopped. He opened it again, even though he knew what was inside. A small black and white photograph stared back at him. Family members arranged stiffly, eyes squinting against a bright day long gone. He traced one face with his thumb, then closed the wallet and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. On the side table rested his military ID tags. They made a faint metallic sound when he picked them up, a sound he had learned to hear even in crowded rooms. He weighed them in his palm, then set them beside the wallet. Not yet. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. Michael appeared in the doorway, hair still damp from sleep, shirt half-buttoned. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "You're up early," Michael said. Eugene smiled faintly. "Habit." Michael nodded, as if that explained everything. He watched his brother pack for a moment before speaking again. "They really need you that far north." Eugene closed the suitcase halfway, then reopened it to adjust a folded shirt that had shifted. "They do," he said. "It's temporary." Michael raised an eyebrow. "That's what you said last time." Eugene met his gaze. "And I came back." The words landed heavier than he intended. He cleared his throat. "I'll write as soon as I arrive." Michael pushed off the doorway and crossed the room. "You always say that, and I usually do." They stood close now, the way they had as boys, when sharing secrets neither wanted overheard. Michael lowered his voice. "Alaska isn't Europe," he said. "It's far." Eugene nodded. He didn't disagree. Distance mattered. He had learned that from letters that arrived too late, from names spoken only in past tense. Still, he believed in schedules and routes, in the idea that movement followed lines you could trace on a map. "It's a posting," he said, "not a disappearance." Michael looked at the suitcase, then back at Eugene's face. "Just promise you won't vanish on me." Eugene laughed softly. "I don't plan to." That was the closest he came to admitting fear. He didn't talk about it directly. Fear was something you acknowledged by preparation, by double-checking papers, by memorizing routes, by choosing aisle seats. He had boarded planes in worse conditions than anything he expected now, or so he told himself. They ate breakfast together at the small kitchen table. Eggs toast, coffee gone lukewarm. The radio murmured in the background, a weather report followed by a song neither of them listened to. Eugene buttered his toast carefully, spreading to the edges. He noticed a crack in the plate he'd never seen before. Afterward, he carried his suitcase to the door. The leather handle creaked under his grip. He hesitated, then reached back to the side table and picked up the ID tags. He threaded the chain through his fingers, then tucked it into his pocket with the wallet. Michael opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet leaves and distant exhaust. Eugene stepped onto the porch and turned back. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll write." Michael nodded, lips pressed tight. "I'll be waiting." The train station was crowded, voices echoing off high ceilings. Eugene navigated through it with practiced ease, suitcase rolling behind him. He checked his watch twice in the span of a minute. Early still. Good. He preferred margin. On the platform, he stood near a column and watched people pass. Couples arguing quietly, a mother adjusting a child's coat, a man pacing, muttering numbers under his breath. Eugene felt the familiar pull of observation, the instinct to catalog details, to anchor himself by noticing. He didn't know why this urge felt stronger today. When the train arrived, he boarded without trouble. The seat fabric was rough against his hand. He placed the suitcase above him, then sat hands folded on his knees. As the train lurched forward, he felt a brief tightening in his chest. He exhaled slowly until it passed. The flight west came and went in segments. Airports blurred into one another. Eugene followed signs, answered questions, showed papers. He slept lightly, waking whenever the engines changed pitch. At one stop, he stood by a window, watching snow fall in thick, drifting sheets. He had seen snow before, of course, but something about this felt different. He couldn't have said why. By the time he reached the final airfield, fatigue had settled into his bones. The Douglas C-124 waited on the tarmac, massive and dull gray. Its bulk softened by blowing snow. Eugene paused at the base of the ramp, looking up at it. He adjusted his coat, then climbed aboard. Inside, the air smelled of fuel and metal. He found a seat along the fuselage and stowed his bag at his feet. Across from him, another passenger shifted boots, scraping. Eugene offered a nod. The man returned it without smiling. As the engine started, the vibration traveled through the floor and into Eugene's legs. He rested a hand on his pocket, feeling the outline of the wallet, the edges of the photograph inside. He thought of Michael standing on the porch of the crack in the plate of the underlined word on the envelope. A crew member moved down the aisle, checking straps. "Weather's rough ahead," he said, voice raised over the noise. "We'll do our best to keep it smooth." Eugene nodded. He had heard worse warnings. Still, he adjusted his belt, pulling it tighter than necessary. The plane lifted, and the ground dropped away. White swallowed the windows. Eugene closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. He told himself this was routine. He told himself he would land, unpack, and write a letter describing the cold. He did not know that this was the last normal thought he would have. The news reached Delaware in fragments, the way bad information often does. A delayed flight. Weather trouble over Alaska. A plane overdue. Michael Smith heard it first from a neighbor who had the radio on too loud, the announcer's voice breaking between static bursts. A military transport missing in the Chugach Mountains. No confirmation of survivors. Michael stood still, one hand on the kitchen counter, the other gripping the edge of a chair. He waited for the name. It didn't come. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at the table where Eugene had eaten breakfast days earlier, the crack in the plate still there, untouched. At dawn, the telephone rang. A measured voice asked if he was family of Colonel Eugene Smith. Michael said yes, before the question finished. "We're still gathering information," the voice said. "There's been an incident." Michael closed his eyes. Was he on that plane? A pause. Paper shifting. Yes. That was all they could say. In Alaska, the mountains did not reveal anything quickly. Search aircraft circled through breaks in weather, their pilots straining against cloud and wind. Snow fell again and again, thick enough to erase tracks within minutes. For days, Eugene Smith existed only as a name on a manifest and a weight in the stomachs of those who had known him. Terrace Moore saw the tail first. He was flying low when the shape caught his eye, a dark line cutting through white. He banked hard, heart hammering, and circled back. The tail section of a Douglas C-124 protruded from the slope metal, torn and twisted. Moore landed nearby with difficulty, boots sinking deep as he stepped out into the cold. The smell reached him before he reached the wreckage. Blood-stained fabric, blankets half buried. The air carried a heaviness that clung to the back of the throat. Moore stood there, hat pulled, low breath fogging, and understood that he could not stay. The slope was unstable. Snow shifted underfoot. One wrong move, and the mountain would take him too. He marked the location as best he could and left. By the time teams returned, the weather had closed in again. Snow piled over what had been visible days earlier. Wind howled through the pass strong enough to knock a man off his feet. Officers on the ground argued briefly, then stopped. The risk was too high. The mountain was not finished. The decision to halt recovery came quietly signed in ink that froze as it dried. Official language replaced human detail. Unrecoverable at this time. Conditions prohibitive. No further action possible. In Delaware, Michael received the letter weeks later. He read it standing up, then read it again sitting down. His hands shook as he folded it and placed it in the drawer where Eugene kept important papers. He stared at the envelope for a long time before closing the drawer. There has to be something, he said aloud, though no one was there to answer. Days turned into months. Months slid into years. The war ended. Another began elsewhere. Eugene Smith's name appeared on lists, marked with careful terminology that avoided certainty. Michael learned to recognize the look people gave him when they asked about his brother. Curious, then cautious. Any news they would say, not yet, he would answer. He waited for letters that would never arrive. Still, he kept the habit Eugene had taught him without meaning to. He checked the mailbox twice each day. Morning, evening. He listened for footsteps on the porch, for the scrape of paper through the slot. In Alaska, the wreckage sank deeper. Snow compressed into ice. Ice moved slow but relentless, carrying metal and cloth and bone away from where the plane had struck. The mountain changed shape around it, smoothing over violence with time and pressure. What had once been visible became sealed inside the glacier's flow. Years later, Michael received Eugene's personal effects, what little had been recovered before the mountain closed. A form letter accompanied them. Regret to inform. Honorable service. Sacrifice. The box was light. Too light. Inside, there was no wallet, no photograph, no ID tags. Just paperwork and a few unidentifiable items wrapped carefully in paper. Michael touched each one, then placed them back exactly as he'd found them. At night, he dreamed of Eugene standing at the edge of a white field, trying to speak over wind. Michael would wake with his heart racing, convinced he had missed something important. He began writing letters he never sent. Pages addressed to Anchorage, to the Air Force, to anyone whose name he could find. He asked the same questions in different words. Did they land? Was there a chance? Where should he go to stand near where his brother last was? The replies, when they came, followed the same shape. Polite, final, regretful. Michael learned the language of waiting. He learned how to mark time by anniversaries that no one else observed. November 22nd became a private date circled in pencil on calendars that changed each year. He took the day off work when he could. He walked, he thought. He remembered small things. The way Eugene folded towels. The way he checked papers twice. He never said the word that people expected him to say. He did not speak of closure. He spoke instead of holding on. Decades passed. Michael grew older. His hair thinned. His hands stiffened. Still, he followed news from Alaska when it appeared in small columns. Reports about glaciers. About aircraft long buried and occasionally revealed. He clipped articles and placed them in folders, labeling them carefully by year. Sometimes he would catch himself thinking absurdly that Eugene had simply taken longer to arrive. In Alaska, the glacier moved on. What had been a crash site became part of the landscape's slow rearrangement. Ice advanced and retreated with the seasons. Meltwater carved channels that shifted year to year. The plane and the men inside it traveled without sound or ceremony. For the families, the effect was not dramatic. It was cumulative. Each year without news layered itself over the last. Children grew up hearing stories of an uncle they had never met. Photographs faded. Details softened at the edges. Michael lived long enough to see his brother's name etched on a memorial list. He traced the letters once with his finger, then stepped back. It felt insufficient, but it was something solid. They stopped looking, someone said to him once, not unkindly. Michael shook his head. No, he said. They stopped reaching. He did not know if that distinction mattered. He only knew that somewhere far away beneath ice that did not care about names, Eugene Smith remained unaccounted for in the way that mattered most to those who loved him. The glacier kept its hold. The files stayed closed. Time continued forward, indifferent but not erasing. And for 60 years, that was all there was. The helicopter crew did not set out that morning to find Eugene Smith. They lifted from the pad, with a checklist already completed, rotors biting into thin summer air. The glacier below them stretched wide and pale, a surface broken by faint lines and shadows that shifted with the sun. Training flight. Routine hours. Nothing in the briefing hinted at history, waiting to interrupt the day. The pilot banked slightly, adjusting for wind. That was when the color appeared. "Do you see that?" the crew chief said, over the headset. A patch of yellow cut through the gray-white expanse, too bright, too deliberate to belong to stone or ice. The helicopter slowed, hovering as the crew leaned toward the windows. From above, the object looked small, almost trivial. But its shape was unmistakable. "A raft," someone said. "That's a raft." They circled once more. The yellow held steady, half embedded in melting ice edges, frayed but intact enough to declare its purpose. A life raft. Not civilian. Military issue, older pattern. The helicopter set down a short distance away. Boots crunched on ice softened by seasonal melt. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with fuel exhaust that faded as the engines wound down. The crew approached carefully, probing ahead with poles alert for hidden cracks. Up close, the raft told its age. Canvas stiffened by decades of cold. Faded stenciling, barely visible, beneath grime. One of the men brushed away slush with a gloved hand. "This didn't just fall out of the sky," he said. No one disagreed. Within days, specialists returned to the glacier. They moved slowly, mapping the surface, marking anything that did not belong to rock or ice. Bits of metal emerged first. Then fabric. Then something that made even experienced hands hesitate. Human bone. Each find shifted the tone. What had been curiosity became care. What had been training became obligation. They documented every location, every fragment, every scrap of material revealed by the retreating ice. Among the items was a small rectangle of metal, dulled but legible. A name, a rank, Kenneth Duval. The connection snapped into place. This was not a random loss. This was the transport aircraft that had vanished decades earlier. The one Eugene Smith had boarded, believing he was simply changing posts. The glacier had carried the wreckage far from the impact site, rearranging the story without erasing it. Word traveled quickly through official channels. Files were reopened. Names moved from dormant categories into active ones. A recovery operation took shape with a new title and an old purpose. Operation Colony Glacier. For Eugene Smith's family, the news arrived through a careful phone call. A measured voice explained that material linked to the 1952 crash had surfaced. That efforts were beginning to retrieve and identify remains. That time finally might move again. Michael Smith was no longer alive to hear it. That fact sat heavy with those who placed the call. They spoke instead to Eugene's niece, who listened in stillness, hands pressed flat against the table. "So, he was there," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," the caller answered. "We believe so." She closed her eyes. For a moment, she pictured the man she knew only through stories. Meticulous, calm, always checking details twice. She wondered what he would have made of this, his life reduced to coordinates and melt patterns, waiting for a century's science to catch up. On the glacier, work continued in narrow windows of weather. Each summer brought a brief chance before snow reclaimed the surface. Teams returned again and again, lifting what the ice allowed, cataloging everything, stopping when conditions shifted. They found personal effects scattered among the debris. Pieces of clothing, a shoe sole worn thin at the heel, a fragment of leather that might once have been a wallet. Each object was photographed, bagged, labeled. No assumptions were made. None could be afforded. A field leader stood over one marked spot, longer than the others. Beneath the translucent ice, something dark lay suspended, distorted by depth. "Mark this," she said quietly. "We'll come back when it opens more." They all understood the patience required. The glacier moved on its own schedule. For decades, it had carried Eugene Smith without regard for urgency. Now, it released him in increments. As samples were flown out, the work shifted from cold to controlled. Laboratories replaced open sky. White coats replaced parkas. But the focus remained fixed to take fragments and rebuild identity. In Delaware, Eugene's niece began assembling what little she had. Letters he had written as a young man. A copy of his service record. A photograph of him standing in uniform, gaze steady, posture exact. She touched the edges of the paper, feeling the grain. He always kept things neat, she told an investigator during one interview. If you're looking at something that was folded carefully, that might be his. The investigator nodded. He had heard similar sentences from other families. Each one different. Each one rooted in habit, not heroics. On the glacier, a team member uncovered a strip of fabric, still bearing a seam line. Nearby, a rusted buckle. They laid the pieces side by side, trying to imagine the body that had once connected them. It felt intrusive and necessary. At the end of one season, they paused work early. Meltwater surged faster than predicted, pooling in channels that cut across their grid. Safety demanded retreat. As the helicopter lifted away, one of the younger team members looked back at the site. It feels like leaving someone mid-sentence, he said. The crew chief glanced at him. We're not leaving, he said. We're waiting. Waiting had defined Eugene Smith's story since the day he failed to arrive. Now waiting carried a different weight. It meant preparation. It meant tools ready. It meant families alerted. The glacier, indifferent to intention, continued its slow work. More fragments would surface. More names would have a chance to be spoken again. Somewhere within the ice's long path lay the things Eugene Smith had carried with him, the wallet, the photograph, the tags he had tucked into his pocket before boarding. Whether they would appear intact or broken, no one could say. What mattered was that the search had shifted from possibility to process. The raft, once bright against the ice, was removed and stored. Its color faded further under laboratory lights. But it had done its work. It had caught an eye. It had interrupted routine. It had opened a door that had been closed for 60 years. Eugene Smith entered this stage of the story without a body. What existed instead were fragments laid out under bright lights, arranged with a care that felt almost reverent. Bone pieces no larger than a thumb joint. Fabric stiffened by decades of cold. A bent clasp that might once have closed something personal. Each item rested in its own labeled container numbers, replacing names for now. A forensic scientist at the table picked up one sample with tweezers and turned it slowly. We'll start here, she said to no one in particular. This one's promising. Promising was a cautious word. It meant density, preservation, a chance. In 1952, Eugene Smith had trusted systems, flight plans, maintenance logs, chains of command. Now, long after his final boarding pass was issued, another system attempted to speak for him. Not with certainty, but with probability, measured carefully, and double-checked the way he would have preferred. The first task was sorting. More than 6,500 samples arrived over multiple seasons, each tagged with precise coordinates from the glacier surface. The work demanded discipline. No rushing. No assumptions. A fragment found near another meant nothing by itself. Ice moved. Time rearranged. The scientist placed one container back into its tray and reached for another. This is where people imagine answers, she said to a colleague. But this is really about questions. Questions shaped like chemical bonds. Questions shaped like partial sequences. DNA extraction from material that old required patience and repetition. Many samples yielded nothing. Others produced incomplete strands damaged by fuel residue or fractured by pressure. Each failure was logged without commentary. Emotion had no role here except as motivation to keep going. For Eugene Smith's family, the waiting returned in a new form. His niece answered emails and phone calls, learning new vocabulary as she went. mtDNA, STR, sequencing depth. She wrote notes in the margins of documents underlining phrases she did not yet understand. Do you need anything else from us? She asked during one call. Possibly, the coordinator replied. Extended family references can help. Cousins. Maternal lines. She nodded, even though the person on the other end could not see it. I'll find them. She began calling relatives she barely knew, explaining why a saliva sample mattered more than comfort. Some hesitated, others agreed immediately. Each envelope sent back felt like a small act of participation in a process Eugene Smith would have respected. In the lab, progress came in increments. One afternoon, a technician looked up from a screen. We have a partial match, he said. The room shifted slightly. Chairs scraped. Someone asked which case Smith, he answered. Eugene. No one celebrated. They leaned in, instead, examining data points that did not yet form a full picture. The match was incomplete, but the alignment suggested a path forward. We'll need corroboration, the scientist said. Dental, if we have it. Personal effects. Personal effects. The word carried weight. Among the cataloged items was a piece of leather cracked but unmistakable in texture. It had been found folded in on itself, edges worn smooth. The scientist held it up, turning it toward the light. This could have been a wallet, she said. Eugene Smith had placed his wallet in his jacket pocket with intention. Inside it, he had kept a photograph he checked more often than he admitted. If this fragment was his, it mattered not because of sentiment, but because it connected habit to evidence. Another tray held a corroded chain links, fused together by time. It was consistent with identification tags of the era. No markings remained visible, but measurements aligned with known standards. The scientist made a note. Potential ID chain. Associate with Smith until proven otherwise. Until proven otherwise was the rule here. Everything waited for confirmation. During one late evening session, a junior analyst rubbed his eyes and leaned back. I keep thinking about what he'd say. If he could see this, he said quietly. The lead scientist did not look up. He'd want us to be precise. That felt right. In Delaware, Eugene's niece stood in a quiet room, holding a copy of his dental records. Ink had faded, but the chart remained legible. Fillings marked. One tooth noted as chipped years earlier. He broke it, opening a bottle, she said aloud, remembering a story told at family gatherings. No one laughed now. She scanned the page and sent it on. Weeks later, the lab called. We have concordance, the coordinator said. Dental aligns. DNA aligns. We're confident. Confident did not mean dramatic. It meant the numbers crossed a threshold. It meant uncertainty narrowed enough to step through. Eugene Smith had a name again, in official records, attached not to a missing status, but to a conclusion reached through methodical care. His case moved from open to resolved, a transition he had overseen countless times for others. The scientist who signed off on the report paused before sending it. She reread the summary, checking for errors. Once more, she checked the identifiers. She imagined Eugene Smith reading this document, pen in hand, scanning for inconsistencies. She smiled faintly and sent it. The notification reached the family on a gray afternoon. Eugene's niece sat at the same table where she had fielded the first call years earlier. The voice on the line was calm. We have identified him, it said. Colonel Eugene Smith. She closed her eyes. Her hand rested flat on the wood, feeling its grain. Thank you, she said. The words felt insufficient, but they were all she had. After the call, she did not cry immediately. She stood and walked to a cabinet where she kept family papers. She took out the photograph Eugene had carried, now preserved in a sleeve. She looked at his face, the steady gaze, the hint of a smile that never quite reached his eyes. They found you, she said. Back in the lab, samples continued to be processed. Eugene Smith's identification did not halt the work. Others still waited. But his case became a reference point, a benchmark for what careful reconstruction could achieve. A scientist taped a small note above her workstation. It read simply, check twice. No one asked why. The items believed to belong to Eugene Smith were prepared for transfer. Each was cleaned only as much as protocol allowed. Nothing was altered beyond necessity. They were placed into containers designed for dignity as much as preservation. As the shipment left the facility, one of the technicians watched it go. Feels like handing someone back, he said. The scientist nodded. It is. For Eugene Smith, the path from glacier to name had taken more than 6 decades. It required patience he never knew he would need, and tools not yet imagined when he boarded that plane. What remained now was not data, but responsibility to return him to those who had waited, and to do so with the care he had shown his entire life. The reconstruction was complete. The next step would be human. The call did not come with ceremony. It came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that gives no warning before it changes shape. Eugene Smith's niece stood by the kitchen window, watching rain slide down the glass in uneven lines. The phone rang once, twice. She answered on the third ring, already holding her breath. We've completed the identification, the voice said. Calm. Careful. We can confirm it is Colonel Eugene Smith. For a moment she said nothing. Her free hand pressed against the counter, fingers spread as if grounding herself mattered. The room smelled faintly of coffee gone cold. You're sure? She asked. Yes, the voice replied. The DNA results align. Dental records confirm it. We're confident. Confident. The words settled differently than she expected. It did not rush at her. It did not knock her down. It sat heavy and exact. "Thank you," she said finally. After the call ended, she remained where she was. The rain continued its steady work outside. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. She thought of Eugene not as a colonel or a case, but as a man who folded towels with care and underlined destinations on envelopes. She opened a drawer and took out the photograph he had carried. The edges were worn soft, the image faded but intact. She traced his outline with her thumb, the same gesture he had once made without thinking. "They kept your word," she said quietly. "They brought you back." The news traveled through the family in careful stages. Each call carried its own pause, its own intake of breath. Cousins, who had never met Eugene, learned to say his name aloud. Stories were repeated, details adjusted as memory passed between mouths. One voice was missing from these conversations. Michael Smith had died years earlier, carrying his waiting with him. That fact returned now with sharp clarity. "If Michael were here," someone said during one call, then stopped. Eugene's niece finished the thought. "He'd want to know where Jean is buried," she said. "He'd want to stand there." She imagined Michael hearing the news, imagined his silence, followed by a single nod. He had never been a man of excess words. The arrangements followed military rhythm. Dates proposed. Options explained. The family listened, asked questions, took notes. Eugene Smith's return was structured, precise, respectful. That felt right. On the day of the transfer, rain fell again, light but persistent. A flag-draped case moved with deliberate pace across polished floors. Shoes echoed softly. Commands were spoken low and clear. A member of the honor guard paused before the family. "We are honored to bring him home," he said. Home. The word carried weight. Eugene Smith returned to Delaware, not as a traveler with a suitcase, but as someone finally accounted for. The journey he had believed temporary had taken decades to complete. At the church, pews filled with people who knew him and people who knew of him. Uniforms mixed with dark coats. The air held the smell of polished wood and damp wool. Eugene's niece sat near the front, hands folded tightly in her lap. As the service began, she felt a shift she had not expected. Not relief, not closure. Something steadier, something like alignment. The priest spoke of duty, of service, of a life defined by integrity. Eugene Smith's name echoed through the space, no longer attached to speculation or files, but to presence. A military officer approached the lectern. "Colonel Smith served his country by pursuing truth," he said. "Today we return that truth to him." Eugene's niece felt her throat tighten. She thought of the careful way he had lived, of the belief that facts mattered, that patience mattered. When the flag was folded and presented, the movement was exact, each crease deliberate. Eugene Smith would have noticed that. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky hung low and gray, but clear enough to breathe. The casket moved again, carried with measured steps. As it passed, Eugene's niece reached out, fingers brushing the smooth surface. "Welcome back," she whispered. Afterward, family members gathered quietly. Coffee was poured. Chairs scraped. Stories surfaced, small and specific. Someone mentioned Eugene's habit of checking documents twice. Another laughed softly at the memory of him correcting a date at a family dinner. "He hated sloppy thinking," one cousin said. "He hated sloppy anything," another replied. In those moments, Eugene Smith felt present in a way he never had as a photograph or a line in a report. He was present through habit, through remembered irritation, through affection shaped by detail. Later that evening, Eugene's niece sat alone, with the items returned to the family. The leather fragment believed to be his wallet rested in a protective case. The chain that once held his identification tags lay beside it, darkened but intact. She lifted the wallet fragment carefully. It smelled faintly of old leather and something colder mineral. She imagined Eugene placing it in his pocket before boarding, a routine motion unremarkable at the time. "You did everything the same," she said softly. Even at the end. She thought again of Michael, of the mornings he had checked the mailbox twice, of the calendars marked in pencil, of the way waiting had shaped his life without ever breaking it. That night, she wrote a letter she would never send. "Dear Uncle Gene, they found you. You would have liked the way they did it. Carefully, thoroughly, no guesses. Michael would have been glad. We all are." She folded the letter once, then again, mirroring Eugene's precision. She placed it with the photograph and closed the drawer. Eugene Smith's name was now spoken without hesitation. His story no longer paused mid-sentence. But something remained unresolved, and it was not a problem to solve. If Michael had been alive, what would he have said? Perhaps nothing at first. Perhaps he would have stood quietly, hands in his pockets, absorbing the fact that waiting had not been wasted. Perhaps finally he would have nodded and said, "Good, he's home." That was enough. For Eugene Smith, the truth had arrived, not as a revelation, but as confirmation. The man who had spent his life assembling facts had been assembled himself, piece by careful piece. What came next was not about proof or process. It was about memory settling into place, about a family learning how to hold a name without tension. Eugene Smith was no longer something to search for. He was someone to remember fully and precisely the way he had lived. By the time Eugene Smith was returned to his family, the glacier had already moved on. It continued its slow descent through the Chugach Mountains, carrying meltwater and stone toward lower ground, indifferent to what it had once held. For the recovery teams, that movement had become familiar, almost personal. They knew its patterns now. They had learned when to approach, when to retreat, when to wait. Eugene Smith was no longer on their list. That fact carried weight. At a briefing room thousands of miles away, a map of Colony Glacier hung on the wall, dotted with faded markers. Colonel Martha Sassnet stood before it, hands clasped behind her back, listening as a final report was read aloud. Names were spoken in sequence, each followed by a date of identification. When Eugene Smith's name was read, she nodded once. "Confirmed," the briefer said. "Return to family." Sassnet made a note in the margin of her folder. She had never met Smith, but she knew his file well. She knew his reputation, his work, the irony that followed him into history. A man who solved cases becoming one himself was not lost on her. "This brings us to the larger question," she said, when the room quieted. "What remains?" The answer was not immediate. For the family's remains meant something specific. A place to stand. A marker that did not require explanation. For Eugene Smith's niece, it meant a headstone. She could touch cool stone beneath her palm, his name carved clean and certain. She visited the cemetery alone one morning, long after the ceremonies ended. Dew clung to the grass. Birds moved through nearby trees, their sounds ordinary and grounding. She knelt briefly, brushing a fallen leaf from the marker. "You'd like this," she said. Everything lined up. She stayed longer than she planned, thinking not of the crash or the glacier, but of Eugene as a living presence. The way he corrected small errors. The way he prepared before acting. The way he believed effort mattered even when outcomes were uncertain. For the recovery teams, what remained was work still to be done. Eugene Smith had been one of 52 aboard the aircraft. One by one, others followed him back through the process of identification. Each case brought its own complexities, its own adjustments to method and expectation. But Eugene's identification marked a turning point. It proved that even after decades of pressure and movement, enough could survive to speak. In the lab, a scientist removed a small note taped above her workstation. "Check twice." She placed it into a drawer rather than discarding it. The habit had outlived the case. Operation Colony Glacier continued, but its shape changed. Seasons passed with fewer discoveries. Teams returned to the ice and found less waiting for them. Where once fragments surfaced regularly, now the glacier offered mostly stone and water. During one final season, a team member stood at the edge of the grid, looking out across the pale expanse. "That's it," he said quietly. No one argued. The decision to close the operation came after careful review. Reports were written, data archived, equipment cleaned and stored. The title Operation Colony Glacier was moved from active status to completed. Colonel Sassnet signed the final document. "This concludes our responsibility here," she said. "It does not conclude our memory." Those words echoed differently for each person in the room. For Eugene Smith's family, memory had shifted from tension to texture. They no longer wondered where he was. They wondered what stories they still had not told each other. His niece began writing down recollections, small moments passed through generations. "He always checked twice," she wrote at the top of one page, then smiled at herself and left it there. For the institution Eugene Smith had served, what remained was example. His name was added to a wall of honored investigators, his career summarized in lines that emphasized integrity and persistence. During one ceremony, a historian spoke briefly. "Colonel Smith believed truth could be reconstructed," he said. His own story proves that belief. The glacier itself offered no commentary. It continued to melt and reform, reshaping the valley in ways that would be studied long after names faded from memory. But for a time it had held Eugene Smith, preserving fragments of a life until tools and patience could retrieve them. That fact lingered. On the anniversary of Eugene's burial, his niece returned to the cemetery with her children. They stood quietly, hands tucked into coat pockets against the cold. She told them about their great-uncle not as a victim or a symbol, but as a man who cared about details. He liked things done properly, she said. He believed it mattered. One of the children traced the letters of Eugene's name with a gloved finger. Did he know he'd be gone so long? The child asked. She shook her head. No, she said. But he trusted people to keep going. That trust had been tested by time, by terrain, by limits of knowledge. It had held. As they left, the stone remained behind, solid and unmoving, a counterpoint to the glacier that had carried Eugene Smith for so many years. The contrast felt important, though she could not fully explain why. What remained finally was not the ice, or the wreckage, or the files closed with careful signatures. It was the understanding that some lives, when interrupted, continue to exert gravity long after movement stops. Eugene Smith had boarded a plane, believing he would write a letter upon arrival. He never did. But in the end, his life was written anyway by hands that checked twice, by voices that waited, by a process that refused to let a name stay unfinished. The glacier released him. The work ended. The memory stayed. Years after the glacier gave Eugene Smith back, his name was spoken aloud in a different place. Not in a lab. Not at a graveside. But in Washington, carved into marble among others who had worn responsibility quietly. A historian from OSI stood before the stone reading from prepared notes. He spoke of investigations, led standards, set trust earned. He did not dwell on the crash. He did not mention the ice. What mattered was that the name was now fixed, no longer provisional, no longer suspended between lines of text. Eugene Smith's niece attended the ceremony without uniform, standing slightly apart. She ran her fingers across the carved letters when no one was looking. The stone was cool, smooth, permanent. Unlike the glacier, it would not move. I can't pretend to know what it feels like to spend a lifetime solving other people's unfinished stories only to leave your own open for 60 years. I only know that Smith's life resisted erasure. It waited. Somewhere in Alaska, ice still shifts and breaks, revealing and concealing in its own time. Other names may still be there, held without sound. Other families may still be waiting without knowing what they wait for. Eugene Smith is no longer among them. What remains is the mark of a man who believed truth could be rebuilt from fragments, and who in the end proved that belief simply by being found.